Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, today is a genuinely special one because the source material we're covering just crossed a massive, massive milestone. Dr. Hakeem Stevens' PhD corrections have officially been signed off, which means he has officially passed. Huge congratulations to Dr. Stevens. So, to celebrate, we're going to do a complete chapter-by-chapter breakdown of his newly approved thesis, using Harvard referencing to really dig into his findings. As Stevens 2026 details in From the Color Bar to the Glass Ceiling, the UK music industry presents this really progressive, culturally diverse image to us, the fans, right? But behind the scenes, it hides a completely different, much harsher corporate reality.
All right, here's our roadmap for the breakdown. We're covering 6 main areas, perfectly tracking his chapters. We'll start with the historical color bar, move into the modern glass ceiling, dive into the lived experiences, unpack intersectionality and mental health, examine the illusion of DEI, and finally, look at how to actually break that glass ceiling.
Okay, Part 1, the historical color bar, taking us through Chapter 2.
Stevens 2026 argues that you absolutely cannot understand today's corporate landscape without looking backwards. The UK recorded music industry actually dates all the way back to 1877. But think about this. Legal protections against workplace racial discrimination didn't exist for decades. Minority ethnic individuals, especially those arriving during the 1940s Windrush era, had to navigate this unofficial colonial-era system of racial segregation called the color bar. And this was long before the 1965 and 1968 Race Relations Acts finally offered some legal workplace protection.
Which brings us to a huge central question. Was that historical, overt color bar actually dismantled by those new laws, or did it just adapt? Stevens 2026 makes the case that the old system didn't disappear. It simply institutionalized itself. It evolved into what we now know as the modern covert glass ceiling, hiding within today's corporate music business structures. Moving right along to Part 2, the modern glass ceiling, which spans Chapters 3 and 4. To really investigate this, Stevens 2026 uses a critical race theory lens, specifically something called counter-storytelling, to challenge the whole idea that the industry is a pure meritocracy. The research triangulates a ton of data from 12 dominant multinational music corporations in the UK. We're talking 20 anonymous insider interviews, 11 focus groups, plus deep archival research. He deliberately bypassed the outward PR spin to document what the corporate reality actually looks like on the inside.
And in Chapter 5, the thematic data analysis maps out the exact barriers holding these executives back. It's a pretty striking list. Stevens 2026 identifies a persistent ethnic pay gap that's basically shielded by secretive wages. Then you have everyday microaggressions hidden behind coded language, a really profound distrust of HR because of racial gaslighting, and a sheer lack of representation at the very top. Minority executives literally have to run an exhausting twice as good gauntlet just to even be considered for a promotion.
That brings us to Part 3, Navigating Lived Experiences, diving deeper into Chapter 5. This right here is the qualitative heart of the thesis. By foregrounding these anonymous executive voices, Stevens 2026 exposes a massive lack of institutional accountability. Listen to this quote from an executive. "I reported it back to my employers, but again, I don't think my employer was equipped to deal with it. They just chose to ignore it." I mean, that completely shatters the mainstream narrative of an inclusive industry, right? It highlights just how ill-equipped corporate HR departments are when it comes to handling complex racial grievances.
Okay, on to Part 4, Intersectionality and Mental Health. Still pulling from the Chapter 5 data.
Now, the research goes beyond just race alone. To truly grasp the mental health toll on the folks making this industry run, Stevens 2026 applies intersectionality, a framework coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. Basically, it examines how overlapping social constructs create totally unique realities. The data clearly shows that the barriers faced by, say, a black woman are uniquely compounded compared to those faced by a white woman or a black man. Just imagine working yourself to the bone, only to get half the recognition of your peers. That's the exact raw reality shared by one black female executive in the study. Stevens 2026 underscores the immense emotional labor, the hypervigilance, and the racial trauma that disproportionately impacts intersectionally marginalized executives. And as you'd probably expect, this often leads to severe mental strain and burnout.
Let's look at Part 5, The Illusion of DEI.
So this chapter also scrutinizes the industry's massive reaction following the 2020 George Floyd catalyst, and Stevens 2026 reveals a really stark contrast here.
Outwardly, we saw a lot of performative allyship, high-profile DI initiatives, black squares on social media, big public diversity pledges. But internally, the data shows deep executive skepticism. These initiatives are largely seen as tokenistic, superficial changes that totally fail to provide any real systemic accountability or tear down those enduring barriers to senior leadership.
Finally, we arrive at Part 6, Breaking the Glass Ceiling, moving into the conclusion in Chapter 6.
So how do we actually dismantle economic racism in this sector? Well, to wrap up his newly signed PhD, Stevens 2026 foregrounds some absolutely vital systemic solutions. He argues powerfully for mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting, very similar to what already exists for gender, and he pushes for true pay transparency through clear pay bands. Plus, and this is a real game changer, the thesis uniquely advocates for the unionization of music industry executives. It's presented as a totally necessary step to protect workers from institutional abuses and actually negotiate fair treatment across the board.
And to close the existing gap in the literature, Stevens 2026 outlines essential steps for future research. For starters, the industry has got to stop using generic catch-all labels like BAME. They need to disaggregate the data to actually understand the nuances of different ethnic groups. He also pushes for long-term longitudinal studies. Basically, we need to track if these corporate diversity interventions are resulting in real career progression over time, or if they're just a quick PR boost.
Which brings us to a final, provocative question inspired by Stevens' concluding statement. The data is clear. The lived experiences are fully documented. The solutions are right there on the table. So, is the corporate music world ever truly going to move beyond the illusion of progress and achieve genuine equity for the executives who actually drive its culture? Huge congratulations once again to Dr. Hakeem Stevens on officially passing his PhD. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.